At the age of 72, Linda Johnson had lived a life filled with hard work and countless sacrifices. Today, however, she felt a spark of joy as she stepped into the familiar McDonald's, intent on buying a happy meal for her cherished granddaughter, Emily. It wasn't a lavish treat, but for little Emily, it meant everything. Linda had promised her a special surprise after school, and the thought of her granddaughter's delighted face kept her heart light. As she entered the bustling restaurant, a wave of cold indifference washed over her. The young employees exchanged glances, whispering and chuckling amongst themselves, casting sideways looks in Linda's direction. Instead of the warmth she had hoped for, she was met with an unwelcoming atmosphere, a familiar sting that echoed through her years of experience. Just as the feeling of humiliation began to settle in, a deep, commanding voice broke through the tension, like a breath of fresh air. The restaurant fell silent, and heads turned toward the entrance, where an unexpected sight awaited. A well-known Hollywood actor, Mark, had just stepped inside. As the patrons and staff recognized him, a mix of surprise and awe rippled through the crowd. Some exchanged excited whispers, while others straightened their postures, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Call to action. Before we dive deeper into the story, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you enjoy stories that inspire change, make sure to stay tuned for more from Flourishing Tales. The golden rays of the setting sun poured into Linda Johnson's small yet cozy apartment, casting a warm glow on the family photos that adorned the walls. Each frame told a story of resilience, love, and sacrifice, chronicling a lifetime of challenges that Linda had faced. At 72, she had weathered her share of storms, navigating a world that often overlooked her simply because of her age and the color of her skin. Yet through it all, she had managed to keep bitterness at bay, allowing kindness to guide her heart. Tonight was particularly special. Her 8-year-old granddaughter, Emily, had spent the entire week raving about the new Happy Meal toy collection at McDonald's. The excitement in Emily's voice had been infectious, and Linda had promised her a delightful surprise after school. It might have been a small gesture, but it was one that meant the world to her granddaughter. Despite her usual reluctance towards fast food, Linda was willing to indulge Emily's enthusiasm. However, recent financial struggles meant that every dollar counted. As Linda calculated the cost of taking a cab, she quickly dismissed the idea. Instead, she laced up her worn-out walking shoes, determined to make the journey on foot. The McDonald's was about 10 kilometers away, but Linda was no stranger to long walks. In her youth, she had marched for civil rights, stood in line for hours at establishments that refused to serve her, and walked to work when public transportation denied her a seat. A little distance didn't daunt her. In fact, it invigorated her spirit. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, Linda felt a sense of purpose wash over her. She tightened her jacket around her shoulders and set off down the street. The bustling sounds of the city enveloped her as she passed cars rushing home, buses filled with weary passengers, and cyclists whizzing by with ease. Though her legs ached with every step, the thought of Emily's gleeful reaction to the Happy Meal kept her moving forward. After nearly 2 hours of walking, Linda finally spotted the bright, welcoming arches of McDonald's glowing against the darkening sky. The familiar scent of crispy fries and sizzling burgers wafted through the air, a tempting contrast to the exhaustion tugging at her body. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before entering the restaurant, relieved to have reached her destination. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with life. Families were gathered around tables, teenagers were laughing, and workers were hurrying to fulfill orders. Linda approached the counter, waiting patiently as a young cashier, Jake, served a customer ahead of her. When the customer left, Linda stepped forward, offering a warm smile. However, instead of acknowledging her presence, Jake turned his attention to another customer, a sharply dressed businessman who had just ducked in. Linda initially thought it was a simple oversight, so she waited silently, hoping to be served next. But as she observed the interactions around her, it became painfully clear that she was being ignored. Minutes ticked by as other customers were served while she stood there, feeling increasingly invisible. Finally, she mustered the courage to speak up, her voice steady yet firm. "Excuse me, young man, I believe I'm next in line." Jake glanced at her, his expression surprised, yet he quickly reverted to his previous indifference. He smirked and said with a hint of sarcasm, "Oh, you're next, huh? Didn't see you there, Grandma." The mockery stung, but Linda chose to respond with dignity. "Good evening, young man. I'd like a Happy Meal with a cheeseburger, apple slices instead of fries, and a chocolate milk, please." She reached into her purse, pulling out her neatly folded bills and placing them on the counter. The laughter and chatter of the other customers continued, but Linda felt increasingly isolated as Jake's attitude shifted from casual to contemptuous. As the scene unfolded, nearby customers began to take notice, some casting sympathetic looks in Linda's direction, while others pretended not to see the unfolding injustice. The atmosphere grew tense, and it was clear that something had to change. Jake arched his eyebrow, looking Linda up and down with an amused smirk that made her stomach tighten. He let out a low chuckle, making no effort to hide his disdain. "Happy Meal, huh? Thought you'd be getting the senior discount instead." His words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. The young cashier shook his head, barely containing his laughter as he turned toward his coworker, Sarah, the shift supervisor. Sarah was a woman in her late 30s with a tight ponytail and an expression of perpetual impatience. Jake muttered loudly enough for Linda to hear, "Man, why do they even come in here? She's probably going to complain about the food anyway." He rolled his eyes dramatically, adding under his breath, "Bet she's one of those who still thinks a burger should cost a quarter." A few customers in line shifted uncomfortably, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones, unwilling to acknowledge the scene unfolding before them. Linda stiffened, the words stinging more than she cared to admit. Throughout her life she had endured countless instances of discrimination, of being looked down upon, of people treating her as if she were less deserving of respect. She had built layers of resilience over the decades, but the pain never truly faded. Each new encounter reopened old wounds. As Sarah took one look at Linda and sighed loudly, rolling her eyes as if serving the elderly woman was the greatest inconvenience of her day. She bagged the meal with obvious carelessness, deliberately skipping the Happy Meal toy that Emily had been so excited about. Linda, assuming it was an oversight, politely reminded her, "Excuse me, dear, I believe this comes with a toy." Sarah huffed loudly, her tone clipped and dismissive. "We're out of toys." The lie was transparent. Linda could clearly see a bin full of colorful Happy Meal toys, sitting behind the counter, waiting to be distributed to other, presumably more worthy customers. A young mother, standing nearby with her child, noticed the exchange and frowned, whispering something to her husband, who shook his head in disapproval. An elderly gentleman sitting at a nearby table looked up from his coffee, his expression troubled as he watched the scene unfold. Linda paused for a moment, debating whether to speak up again. She had learned long ago to choose her battles carefully. Instead of making a scene, she simply nodded. "All right, thank you." Her voice was quiet but dignified, a stark contrast to the rudeness she was facing. She reached for the bag, but Sarah pulled it back slightly, staring at Linda as if expecting something more. "Actually," Sarah said slowly, eyeing Linda up and down with unconcealed contempt, "I need you to pay first." Linda blinked, confused by the sudden demand. "I already did, sweetheart," she said gently, tapping the cash still sitting on the counter. The money had been there the entire time, neatly arranged and exact to the penny. Jake glanced down, realizing Linda was right, but before he could speak, Sarah shook her head dismissively. "Sorry, but we have a policy. Some customers need to verify payment before receiving their order." The emphasis on some customers was unmistakable, dripping with implication. A cold weight settled in Linda's chest as the meaning behind Sarah's words became clear. This wasn't about the money, it was about who Linda was. It was about the assumptions Sarah and Jake had made the moment she walked through the door. The restaurant had grown quieter now, with more people noticing the confrontation. Some looked embarrassed on Linda's behalf, others seemed uncomfortable, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Linda straightened her shoulders, summoning the dignity that had carried her through decades of similar encounters. "Young lady, I have already paid for my granddaughter's meal. Please hand it over." Her voice didn't waver, though her heart was racing. Sarah smirked slightly, as if enjoying the power she held in that moment. "Ma'am, I'm just following store policy. If you don't like it, you can leave." The challenge in her voice was clear, daring Linda to escalate the situation. Linda gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles whitening with the effort. She wasn't going to let this moment define her, but the humiliation was undeniable. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The restaurant fell into a hushed silence, and every head turned toward the entrance. Standing there, tall and commanding, was Mark, the famous Hollywood actor. His presence was magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The moment the patrons recognized him, a wave of murmurs swept through the crowd, tinged with excitement and astonishment. Some customers straightened in their seats, their eyes wide with disbelief, while others whispered among themselves, trying to wrap their hairs around the unexpected encounter. Linda turned slowly, her weary eyes meeting Mark's gaze. His expression was calm but intense, and there was a flicker of fury behind his friendly demeanor. Without breaking eye contact with Sarah and Jake, he stepped forward, the sound of his boots on the tiled floor echoing through the now silent restaurant. He leaned slightly on the counter, exuding an air of authority that made even the most arrogant of employees hesitate. "I've been watching this whole situation unfold," Mark said, his voice resonating with a controlled power that demanded respect. "Can someone explain to me why this woman, who has already paid for her meal, is being treated this way?" His eyes darted between Sarah and Jake, who were momentarily rendered speechless, their previous bravado stripped away by the weight of his presence. Jake swallowed hard, his confidence evaporating as he stood frozen behind the counter. He opened and closed his mouth, searching for words that would justify their behavior but finding none. Sarah, however, was not ready to back down. "Sir, this is none of your concern. We have policies in place, and we are simply following them," she protested, trying to maintain her composure. Mark's expression darkened, and he let out a low chuckle, devoid of humor. "That's interesting," he replied, tilting his head slightly as he regarded her. "Because I eat at McDonald's all the time, and I've never had to verify payment before receiving my food. And I certainly don't recall any policy that says a Happy Meal toy can be denied when there are plenty sitting right behind you." The tension in the room thickened as other customers began to take notice of the confrontation. Some exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from surprise to discomfort as they witnessed the blatant injustice unfolding before them. An elderly woman sitting at a nearby table leaned forward, her brow furrowed with concern for Linda, while a group of teenagers whispered excitedly, captivated by the unfolding drama. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her bravado faltering under Mark's penetrating gaze. "Look, sir, we don't have time to argue about this. If she wants her food," she began, but Mark cut her off, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "If you don't hand her that bag right now, I assure you this will turn into a much bigger problem than you ever imagined." The weight of his words hung in the air, and the atmosphere shifted as tension rippled through the restaurant. Linda felt a rush of gratitude toward Mark, her heart swelling with the unexpected support. Jake's confidence shattered completely, and he quickly grabbed the bag off the counter, handing it to Linda with a nervous, apologetic expression. "Here you go, ma'am," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Linda paused, still in disbelief at the sudden turn of events. "Thank you," she said softly, though the joy of receiving the meal was overshadowed by the humiliation she had endured. Mark, however, wasn't finished. He straightened up, his demeanor shifting from fierce to compassionate as he addressed the crowd. "I hope you all understand something important," he said, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't just about a meal, it's about how we treat people. You think she didn't notice what you were doing? You think no one else noticed?" His gaze swept over the onlookers, many of whom were now visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as the reality of the situation sank in. Mark continued, "Trust me, everyone saw, and more importantly, they'll remember." The impact of his words lingered in the air, and a few customers nodded in agreement, acknowledging the truth of his statement. With the power dynamic shifting, Linda finally found her voice, straightening her posture, and looking directly at Sarah. "I've dealt with people like you my whole life," she said, calm but firm. "You're not the first to treat me like I don't belong, and you won't be the last. But today is different." Someone actually stood up and said something. As the weight of her words settled, the restaurant was enveloped in a heavy silence, the atmosphere charged with a newfound awareness of the importance of kindness and respect. The tension in the McDonald's was palpable, and the atmosphere shifted dramatically as the realization of what had just transpired settled over the crowd. Linda stood tall, her heart racing with a mix of gratitude and indignation. She had faced countless moments of disrespect throughout her life, but this time she felt empowered by Mark's intervention. The other customers, who had been mere bystanders moments before, began to murmur among themselves, their expressions reflecting a mix of shame and support. Mark, still standing near the counter, turned his gaze back to Jake and Sarah. "You both need to understand something," he said, his voice steady but carrying an underlying intensity. "People like Linda deserve respect, not ridicule. It's not just about following policies, it's about treating everyone with dignity, no matter their age or background." His words resonated deeply, and a few customers nodded in agreement, the sense of community growing stronger as they rallied behind Linda. Jake, visibly shaken and overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events, cast his eyes downward, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Sarah, however, attempted to maintain her composure, but her bravado had all but crumbled. The reality of the situation was sinking in, and she could feel the weight of the customers' stares as they judged her behavior. The restaurant's ambiance had transformed from one of indifference to a shared sense of responsibility. Linda glanced around, noticing the sympathetic expressions of the patrons. Some were whispering supportive comments, while others appeared genuinely embarrassed by what they had witnessed. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, knowing she was no longer alone in this fight. Mark took a step closer to Linda, his demeanor softening. "Ma'am, do you need a ride home?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Linda hesitated for a moment, taken aback by the kindness of this stranger who had come to her aid in such a public way. She had always prided herself on her independence, but tonight she felt the weight of her journey more than ever. After a moment of contemplation, she nodded, a small smile breaking through her earlier discomfort. "That would be very kind of you," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude. As Mark gently took the Happy Meal bag from her, their hands brushed briefly, and she felt a sense of connection that transcended the circumstances of the moment. As they began to walk toward the exit, Linda glanced back at Jake and Sarah, who stood frozen, their expressions a mix of shame and disbelief. The other customers continued to murmur among themselves, some exchanging glances of solidarity with Linda. She realized that the moment had sparked something important, a collective recognition that the treatment of others mattered, that everyone deserved compassion. Once outside, the cool evening air wrapped around them like a comforting blanket. Mark opened the passenger door of his car for Linda, a gesture that felt both respectful and genuine. As she settled into the seat, she let out a sigh of relief, the weight of the earlier humiliation lifting slightly. "Thank you for standing up for me," Linda said, her voice soft yet sincere. Mark smiled, his eyes reflecting a warmth that made her feel seen. "I didn't do anything special. It's just what anyone should do. Stand up for what's right," he replied, his tone humble. As they drove through the city streets, Linda found herself reflecting on the events of the evening. She had long ago learned to keep her head up in the face of adversity, but tonight had restored a sense of hope in her heart. It wasn't just about receiving her happy meal, it was about the solidarity that had emerged in a moment of injustice. Mark glanced over at her, sensing her contemplation. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "sometimes we all need a reminder that our actions can make a difference. It's easy to stay silent when we see something wrong, but speaking up is where real change begins." Linda nodded, realizing the truth in his words. It was a lesson she hoped to carry forward, not just for herself, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. Tonight, she felt empowered not just to stand up for herself, but also to inspire others to do the same. As they drove through the bustling streets, the city lights twinkling like stars against the night sky, Linda felt a sense of calm wash over her. The earlier tension from the McDonald's incident began to fade, replaced by a comforting warmth that came from Mark's presence. She glanced at him, grateful for his kindness and the unexpected support he had shown her. "Tonight turned out much differently than I expected," Linda said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, reflecting the whirlwind of emotions she had experienced. "I was just hoping to get a simple meal for my granddaughter. I never imagined it would lead to something like this." Mark chuckled lightly, his eyes on the road ahead. Life has a way of throwing surprises at us, doesn't it? Sometimes it takes a moment like that to remind us of what really matters: compassion and standing up for one another. Linda nodded, contemplating his words. You're right. I've faced my share of challenges over the years, and I've learned to pick my battles. But tonight was different. It feels good to have someone stand up for me, to be reminded that not everyone will turn a blind eye. Mark glanced at her, his expression serious. You shouldn't have to feel grateful for receiving respect. Everyone deserves it, regardless of their age or background. It's disheartening that people still judge others based on superficial things. Linda looked out the window, watching the world pass by. She had spent too many years feeling invisible, and tonight's experience had brought a flood of memories rushing back, moments when she had been dismissed or overlooked simply because of who she was. When I was younger, I would have shouted or demanded to be treated fairly, she admitted, her voice tinged with nostalgia. But now, I find myself getting tired. It feels like I'm fighting a battle I shouldn't have to. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly as he considered her words. That's understandable. It's exhausting to constantly advocate for yourself, especially when it feels like the world is against you. But it's important to remember that your voice matters. Speaking up can spark change, not just for yourself but for others as well. Linda turned to look at him, appreciating his perspective. You're right. I've always believed that change takes time. But I never thought about how each small act could contribute to something bigger. Sometimes I forget that my experiences can inspire others to take action too. As they navigated through the city streets, Mark shared stories of his own experiences with injustice and the importance of using his platform to advocate for positive change. Linda listened intently, feeling a sense of camaraderie with him. They were both fighting their battles in different arenas, but their shared belief in the power of compassion connected them. Finally, they arrived at Linda's apartment complex, the familiar sight of home bringing a sense of comfort. The lights were off inside, indicating that Emily was likely still at her friend's house, just as planned. Linda took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief wash over her. Thank you for the ride, Mark. I truly appreciate everything you've done tonight, she said sincerely as she opened the car door. Mark smiled warmly. It was my pleasure, Linda. And remember, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. You've got a friend in me now. She chuckled softly, shaking her head. Now, how would I go about getting in touch with a Hollywood star? Mark grinned. Let's just say I have my ways. As she walked toward her apartment, Linda turned back to wave goodbye, feeling a sense of gratitude swell within her. The night had turned into an unexpected journey of strength, connection, and the realization that she was not alone. She had been reminded that kindness exists, even in the most unlikely of places, and that she could continue to stand up for herself and others. As she entered her home, she set the Happy Meal on the counter, ready for Emily's return. Tonight had been a reminder that the world still had good people in it, and that every act of courage, no matter how small, could contribute to a larger change. Linda stepped into her small apartment, the familiar scent of home enveloping her like a warm embrace. The walls, adorned with family photographs and cherished mementos, reminded her of the love and resilience that had shaped her life. Tonight had been a whirlwind of emotions, but as she placed the Happy Meal on the counter, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. With Emily still at her friend's house, Linda took a moment to gather her thoughts. She was grateful for the unexpected kindness she had received from Mark. His intervention had not only changed the course of her evening, but had also reignited a spark of hope within her that had dimmed over the years. She thought about how often she had felt invisible, overlooked, and dismissed. But tonight, she had been seen, not just by Mark, but by the other customers who had witnessed the injustice at McDonald's and had shared in her experience. As she prepared a cup of tea, Linda reflected on her conversation with Mark. His words about standing up for oneself resonated powerfully. She realized that she had been holding back, allowing others to define her worth instead of asserting her right to be treated with dignity. It was a lesson she would carry forward, not just for herself but for the generations that would follow her. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Emily, bursting with energy as she entered the apartment. Her face lit up when she spotted the Happy Meal on the counter. "Grandma, you got it," she exclaimed, running over to grab the bag. Linda laughed, her heart swelling with joy. "I did, sweetheart, and I got you a special surprise inside," she said, watching Emily's excitement grow as she tore open the bag to reveal the colorful toy inside. As Emily played with her new toy, Linda couldn't help but smile. This small moment of happiness was what she had walked miles for. Every step worth it for the joy it brought to her granddaughter. "Did you have fun at your friend's house?" she asked, settling down at the table with her tea. Emily nodded enthusiastically. "We played so many games, but I missed you, Grandma. I can't wait to tell you all about it." As Emily chattered on about her day, Linda felt a warmth envelop her heart. This was what life was about: connection, love, and the little moments that brought joy. She realized that her experience at McDonald's had not only been about standing up for herself, but also about teaching Emily the importance of kindness and respect. Later that evening, as they settled down to watch a movie together, Linda's mind wandered back to Mark's words. She wanted to share what she had learned with Emily, to instill in her the values of compassion and courage. "You know, sweetie, it's important for us to always stand up for what's right," she said gently, looking into her granddaughter's eyes. "No one should ever feel like they don't matter." Emily looked up, her face serious for a moment. "I promise, Grandma, I'll be brave like you," she declared, and Linda felt a surge of pride. She realized that her actions had the potential to inspire not just her granddaughter but others around her as well. As the credits rolled on the movie, Linda felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had always believed in the power of stories to bring about change, and now she understood that her own story was still being written. The evening had highlighted the importance of standing together against injustice and had reminded her that no matter how small the act, it could ripple out and create a wave of change. The night ended with Linda feeling a sense of hope and connection, knowing that she would continue to fight for herself and others, armed with the knowledge that compassion could transform lives. As she turned off the lights and tucked Emily in, she whispered a silent promise to herself to always be a weaver of change, fostering kindness and courage in every step she took.